Night falls over a sea that looks calm enough to forgive everything. The surface darkens into hammered metal, and the islands become silhouettes black and still against the horizon. Nothing in that quiet water announces what it has done before. Nothing in the wind says that coastlines have vanished here, that harbours have been broken, that ships have been lifted inland and smashed like driftwood, that whole communities once watched the edge of their world change shape in a matter of hours. Yet this is often how the greatest disasters leave themselves behind, not as a permanent wound visible to everyone forever, but as a landscape that heals just enough to become deceptive. A bay fills with silt. A ruined town disappears beneath pumice and ash. A shoreline slips under rising water. The survivors die, their children remember fragments, and centuries later the event returns wearing the clothes of legend. Somewhere inside that process lies the strange durability of Atlantis. It survives because it does not behave like a normal invented place. Pure fantasies usually drift free of geography. They become symbolic very quickly. Atlantis does something else. It keeps dragging the imagination back toward the earth, toward maps, islands, eruptions, drowned plains, broken ports, and the uneasy possibility that a story too famous to trust might still contain a memory too old to dismiss. The name has become almost useless through overuse attached to every underwater wall, every satellite image, every hopeful ridge on the ocean floor. But beneath all that noise sits a much older and more serious question. What if the reason this story has never gone away is not that people love fantasies about lost perfection, but that human beings are very good at remembering catastrophe even when they no longer remember it clearly? This is where the subject becomes more interesting than the usual search for a missing city. The real mystery is not whether divers will one day find a marble capital waiting intact under the sea. The real mystery is whether a tale recorded in the ancient world could preserve the echo of an actual disaster that shattered real communities and then passed into memory so slowly, so unevenly, that by the time it reached writing it had become both true and untrue at once. Scholars still debate how much historical value can be extracted from such stories, and the evidence remains incomplete, but myth and memory have never been cleanly separated in human history. People do not remember the past as archives remember it. They remember in images, they remember in warning tales. They remember the wave, the fire, the black sky at noon, the land that was there and then was not. That possibility matters because the ancient world is full of landscapes now missing from the world we know. At the end of the last ice age, seas rise and coastlines retreat. Places where people once hunted buried their dead, built shelters, and watched the seasons disappear beneath encroaching water. Later earthquakes erase ports, tsunamis rewrite shorelines, volcanoes turn inhabited islands into rings of broken stone. In the Mediterranean especially, nature has always had a taste for abrupt corrections. Beneath the polished surfaces of classical memory lies a much harsher older world, one in which prosperous coastal societies live with constant geological risk. A civilization can look secure for generations and still be one eruption or one convulsion away from permanent alteration. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The temptation with Atlantis has always been to begin at the end with the grand claim that an advanced island civilization sank beneath the sea in a single dreadful span of time. But the deeper story starts earlier in the simple human habit of turning unbearable events into narratives that can be carried. A disaster too large to hold in ordinary memory is given shape. It becomes attached to a place name, a moral lesson, a divine punishment, a kingdom, a proud people, a warning against arrogance, a lament for what was lost. Over time, the story accumulates new layers. The facts do not vanish exactly. They compress. They migrate. They harden into symbols. Fire becomes wrath. Flood becomes judgment. A harbour becomes a continent. A real island becomes an impossible empire. This does not mean every myth hides a newspaper report. Most do not. Many are philosophical, ritual, or literary constructions first and foremost. Atlantis itself enters recorded history through a writer with his own motives, and those motives matter. Yet even carefully shaped stories can draw power from older memories already alive in the culture around them. A storyteller does not need to invent every ingredient. He can inherit fear. He can inherit fragments of places destroyed before his time. He can inherit the prestige of older civilizations, rumours of vanished islands, and the stubborn recollection that the sea has not always respected the line where land ends. There is something else that gives Atlantis its peculiar weight. Unlike many ancient wonders, it arrives already marked by absence. No pilgrim can visit it. No empire can claim it. No priesthood can point to its shrine. It is known only through testimony, which immediately places it in that uneasy space between history and metaphor. And yet testimony of this kind was often built from things people considered plausible. Ancient Mediterranean societies knew storms, quakes, volcanic violence, and inundation. They knew that islands could be dangerous and seas could turn murderous. They knew prosperous places could fall. What survives in the record suggests that sudden destruction was not an abstract terror to them. It was part of the world's character. So the question is not really whether Atlantis exists in the way popular imagination prefers waiting to be discovered like a sealed tomb with its streets untouched. No serious evidence supports that simple version. The more compelling possibility is narrower and stranger. Atlantis may not be a myth in the sense of being detached from reality. It may be a memory, though memory altered by centuries of retelling philosophy, political symbolism and human exaggeration. Not a map, but a scar. Not a literal blueprint of one lost kingdom, but a composite made from real ancient instability, drowned coasts, shattered island cultures, and a deep cultural awareness that flourishing societies can disappear faster than they believe possible. That is why the legend has remained so hard to kill. It speaks to a fear older than written history. Civilizations like to imagine that decline arrives with notice, that collapse is visible far off, that power buys time. The Earth is under no such obligation. A thriving port can become a ruin before its trade partners understand what has happened. A generation can inherit prosperity and then spend its final days fleeing ash, saltwater, famine, and silence. The ancient world knew this intimately. Its monuments can trick us into seeing permanence, but permanence was never the rule. Survival was, and somewhere perhaps in the long passage from lived disaster to polished tale, from shattered coastline to philosophical warning, from smoke on the horizon to a name spoken centuries later, Atlantis begins. Not as a perfect city swallowed in a single theatrical gesture, but as the afterimage of real terror in a region where the land itself has always been unreliable. The sea keeps its secrets well, but not perfectly. Sometimes it leaves memory behind. Sometimes memory is all that remains. Long before Atlantis becomes a modern obsession, it appears in a very specific place under controlled conditions in the work of a writer who is too intelligent to be treated carelessly. The first solid ground in this story is not an island, but a text. Atlantis enters history through Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, and that fact alone has shaped every argument ever since. If the story had surfaced in a loose collection of sailors' tales, it might have remained one more curious rumour from the edges of the known world. Because it appears in Plato, it acquires a different kind of weight and a different kind of problem. He's not merely preserving a legend, he is using one. The tale is told mainly in two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, where Plato places it within a much broader meditation on ideal societies, political decline, order, and catastrophe. In his account, the story has already travelled through several hands. It is said to have come from Egyptian priests to the Athenian lawgiver Solon, and then through generations into the present telling. That chain has always tempted readers because it seems to promise antiquity, authority, and continuity. Yet it also creates distance. The Atlantis we know is already framed, already filtered, already selected for purpose. It does not arrive as raw memory, it arrives arranged. What Plato describes is arresting. Beyond the Pillars of Heracles, usually understood as the Strait of Gibraltar, lies a great island power. Atlantis is wealthy, expansive, technically impressive, and militarily formidable. Its capital is laid out in concentric rings of land and water. It possesses harbours, canals, temples, and rich natural resources. At its peak, it is formidable enough to threaten lands closer to the Mediterranean world, including an ancient and virtuous Athens that in Plato's version resists the Atlantean assault. Then comes the end. In a terrible span of earthquakes and floods, Atlantis sinks beneath the sea and becomes inaccessible, leaving behind mud and shallows. It is a dramatic image, but just as important is the structure beneath it. The story is moral as much as geographical. Power grows corrupt, greatness decays, nature and fate erase what hubris has swollen. That moral architecture is why many scholars treat Atlantis first as a philosophical invention. Plato is deeply interested in the rise and fall of states, in what makes societies just, or disordered, disciplined, or decadent. Atlantis serves that interest almost too well. It is a splendid antagonist, rich enough to be impressive, flawed enough to deserve collapse, and distant enough to allow bold imaginative construction. No single explanation fully accounts for the story, but the literary design is impossible to ignore. Plato does not present Atlantis as a neutral report. He presents it as part of an argument about civilization itself, and yet dismissing the whole thing as pure invention has always felt slightly too clean. Plato invents freely in many places, but he also works with inherited materials, cultural memories, and motifs his audience would find meaningful. He does not create in a vacuum. Even if Atlantis is shaped into a philosophical instrument that does not tell us whether every element in it is fabricated. Ancient authors often folded real geography, distorted recollection, and older traditions into moral narrative. The evidence remains incomplete, but the important distinction is between a wholly fictional world and a story built from recognizable historical debris. Plato may have done the latter without any obligation to separate fact from usefulness. Some details encourage caution in both directions. The grandeur of Atlantis often looks suspiciously idealized, almost like a mirror image of the kind of state Plato wants to analyze. Its scale is difficult to reconcile with anything known from Bronze Age archaeology. The chronology he gives placing the events thousands of years before Solon creates further difficulty. Greek writers and readers did not calculate deep antiquity with modern precision, and Egyptian chronology passing through later retellings could easily become distorted, but the numbers are still awkward. Then there is the setting beyond Gibraltar, which points westward in a way that has fueled centuries of speculation. Some interpreters take this literally. Others think Plato relocates or enlarges older Mediterranean disaster memories to suit the scale of his narrative. What survives in the record suggests he was perfectly capable of moving pieces around to make a story more resonant. The Egyptian connection deserves its own caution. For later readers, Egypt lends the story a seductive authority because Egyptian civilization already appeared unimaginably ancient to the Greeks. To say that priests in Egypt preserved the account was to give it depth and prestige. But this too may be part of the construction. Egypt functions in Greek thought as a storehouse of old wisdom, sometimes real, sometimes imagined. That does not prove deception. It simply means the frame itself is doing narrative work. The source is impressive because it is meant to be impressive. Then there is the most famous feature of all the sinking. Atlantis does not merely fall politically. It disappears physically, leaving almost nothing that can be checked. This is the genius and the danger of the story. A city that survives can be tested against ruins. A city swallowed by the sea becomes infinitely reusable. Every generation can project its own fears and hopes into that absence. But the ancient Mediterranean did know places that had sunk coastlines, that had shifted ports that had been damaged by seismic violence, and islands altered by volcanic force. Plato's audience did not need supernatural imagination to grasp the plausibility of land lost to water. They lived in a world where earth and sea regularly renegotiated their boundaries. One lesser-known detail about Plato's Atlantis is that its destruction is paired with another disappearance, the loss of the ancient Athenians who defeat it. This matters. Plato is not simply lamenting a vanished enemy kingdom. He's also constructing an older, nobler Athens, a city that once embodied the virtues he admires before later generations forgot them. Atlantis and primeval Athens rise together inside the same rhetorical design. One is splendid but morally swollen. The other is disciplined and just. Both are largely unreachable except through story. That symmetry should make anyone cautious about reading the text as straightforward history. Still, caution is not the same as indifference. Plato's version gives us the earliest full literary form of Atlantis, but probably not the earliest raw materials behind it. Islands shattered by eruption, harbours destroyed by sea surges, memories of a prosperous maritime culture brought low stories passed from one people to another and altered by prestige and distance. These are the sorts of fragments that can enter a tale long before a philosopher gives them architecture. Scholars still debate whether any identifiable event lies under the surface of Atlantis, but the question remains alive because Plato's story feels as though it is feeding on something older than itself, something heavy enough to endure transformation. So Atlantis begins in writing not as a neat historical claim, but as a layered object. It is literature, political thought, inherited memory, geographic imagination, and warning all at once. That complexity is why the story has lasted. If it were only a moral fable, it would likely have remained in classrooms. If it were only a sailor's rumour, it might have vanished into folklore. Instead, it sits between categories too vivid to dismiss casually, too artful to trust literally. The island Plato gives us is already half submerged before it ever sinks, one part argument, one part recollection, one part absence. And from that unstable foundation the search begins. The world that may have fed the memory of Atlantis is older than Plato, and much larger than any single island. It begins at the end of the Ice Age, when the shape of the Earth is changing on a scale almost impossible to hold in one human lifetime, yet still close enough to human experience to be felt, feared and remembered. Great ice sheets that had locked away vast amounts of water begin to melt. Seas rise, shorelines retreat. Plains that once lay open to hunters, foragers, fishers, and early settlers slowly disappear beneath advancing salt water. Some losses are gradual enough to become part of the rhythm of generations. Others may have come in violent surges, storm-driven incursions, collapsing coasts, or sudden local floods when natural barriers fail. The details vary from place to place, and scholars still debate how rapidly some of these transitions unfolded, but the broad fact is clear. The coasts of the early Holocene are not the coasts the ancient world inherits later. This matters because memory does not need a continent to create a legend. It does not even need a city. It needs only the repeated human experience of once familiar ground becoming unreachable. A stand of trees that used to be farther out now stands in surf. A burial place disappears. A seasonal camp must be abandoned. A marsh turns to a bay. A narrow channel becomes open water. What survives in the record suggests that prehistoric communities around the world lived on coastlines that are now submerged, and the archaeological silence beneath modern seas is not proof of emptiness. It is often proof of inaccessibility. The world has lost an unknown number of ancient shore settlements, simply because the water rose over them and stayed there. In the Mediterranean and its connected seas, this slow drama unfolds over thousands of years, shaping the inherited geography of later civilizations. The Mediterranean itself is already an old basin, with an even older history of flooding and transformation, but the shorelines around it continue to shift throughout prehistory. Estuaries deepen, lagoons change, islands alter their relationship to the mainland. Safe anchorages do not remain eternally safe. The Aegean in particular, with its fractured coasts, narrow straits and restless tectonic setting, offers exactly the kind of landscape where human memory and geological instability might become entangled. It is a world of short sea crossings and long recollections of communities close enough to trade stories and close enough to share fear. There is a tendency in modern imagination to picture ancient people as static, living inside timeless landscapes until history begins. The reality is more restless. Prehistoric and early historic societies often inhabit dynamic environments, and they notice. They may not measure sea level change with instruments, but they know when old fishing grounds are gone, when fresh water becomes brackish, when storms begin to bite farther inland, when a spit of land breaks, when a harbour silts up, when a familiar route can no longer be trusted. Their descendants carry not a graph or a stratigraphic profile, but a story. Once there was land there, once the water was lower, once the sea took more than it should have. This is one reason flood traditions appear so widely in the ancient world. Not because every tale refers to one single global event, and certainly not because all flood myths are straightforward historical records, but because water is one of the oldest destroyers of human certainty. Rivers overflow, coasts erode, storm surges tear through settlements, tsunamis arrive without warning, seas advance by increments too slow for drama, and yet dramatic in aggregate. No single explanation fully accounts for the spread of such stories, but communities repeatedly exposed to watery loss do not need much encouragement to turn inundation into sacred history. A flood is both physical and symbolic at once. It removes boundaries. It erases ownership. It humiliates walls, fields, roads, and shrines with equal indifference. One lesser-known complication is that many of the most vulnerable prehistoric landscapes are now the hardest to study. The evidence is not absent so much as difficult. Underwater archaeology has revealed drowned forests, submerged structures, ancient tools, and traces of habitation in various parts of the world, but the search is expensive, technically demanding, and incomplete. Vast stretches of paleo coastline remain unexplored. The sea has preserved some things beautifully and destroyed others beyond recognition. Organic materials decay, sediment buries, currents scatter. A coastline lost 10,000 years ago may still hold answers, but it rarely yields them easily. This incomplete archive leaves room for both careful inference and reckless speculation. which is why Atlantis so often flourishes where evidence thins. Yet the broader picture does not require fantasy. Entire inhabited zones really did vanish from the living map of later peoples. For those who came afterward, a story about a once-occupied land now underwater would not have sounded absurd. It would have sounded eerie, distant, and possibly true. The passage from memory to legend becomes easier when the place in question can no longer be checked. A submerged plain turns into a vanished kingdom almost by instinct. Details accrete. Prestige rises. Human imagination hates a blank space, and the sea provides the grandest blank spaces of all. There's also an emotional logic here that matters more than exact chronology. Long-term sea rise on its own is rarely the stuff of sudden epic narrative. It works slowly, often invisibly across generations. But communities do not experience environmental change as an abstract average. They experience it through episodes, the storm that reaches farther than any before it, the year the shoreline collapses, the strange season, when graves wash out, the day the old crossing cannot be crossed. Memory gathers around shocks, not trends. A real landscape can be transformed gradually and still be remembered through the language of abrupt loss. This may help explain how ancient disaster stories often compress time. Centuries of vulnerability can crystallize into a single terrible night. By the time literate civilizations dominate the Mediterranean, the memory of older drowned worlds is likely already layered and uneven. Some traditions may preserve local recollections. Others may fold multiple events into one. A coastal collapse here, a great storm there, an earthquake-driven wave elsewhere, all entering the cultural reservoir from which later tales draw. The evidence remains incomplete, but the ancient world inherits more than land and monuments from prehistory. It inherits anxieties shaped by unstable margins between water and habitation. It inherits the knowledge that the edge of safety is not fixed. So when Atlantis later appears as an island swallowed by the sea, the image lands in a world already prepared to understand it. Not because everyone remembers the same lost place, but because the idea of land undone by water belongs to a very old human experience. Beneath the polished philosophical surface of the Atlantis tale may lie this deeper background millennia of drowned coasts, broken shorelines, and ancestral unease carried forward in mythic form. Before there is any one candidate for Atlantis, before there is any volcanic island or ruined Bronze Age harbour, there is this older truth. The sea had been taking worlds long before anyone gave one of them a name. By the time the eastern Mediterranean becomes a world of palaces, harbours, storehouses, and fast-moving ships, the sea is no longer merely a boundary. It is the road, the market, the messenger, and the threat that underwrites everything else. This is the Bronze Age world of islands, and it is here that the Atlantis question begins to feel less abstract. If a memory of a real disaster survives anywhere behind the later legend, it would make sense for it to emerge from this maritime sphere where wealth depends on fragile connections and where destruction can travel outward from one point in widening circles. A prosperous island in such a world is not an isolated jewel. It is a knot in a living network. Cut the knot sharply enough and damage spreads far beyond the coast where the first blow falls. Across the Aegean and the wider eastern Mediterranean from roughly the 3rd to the 2nd millennium, BCE societies grow increasingly complex in ways that bind them to the sea. Crete rises to extraordinary prominence through what modern scholars call the Minoan civilization, though that label is itself a later convenience. Palaces appear at Knossos, Paistos, Malea, and elsewhere not as lonely royal residences, but as administrative centres tied to craft production, storage, ritual and exchange. On the mainland, communities that will later be associated with the Mycenaean world build their own centres of power. Farther east and south, Egypt and the states of the Near East participate in a connected world of prestige goods, diplomatic contact and commercial movement. Copper tin pottery textiles, oil wine, ivory pigments, and worked metals move across water in quantities that only make sense in a deeply maritime civilization. This network is impressive, but it is also precarious in ways that stone ruins can hide from us. Maritime prosperity depends on harbours functioning on ships, surviving on routes remaining predictable enough, on political trust, holding just long enough on harvests and workshops and crews all doing their part. A drought inland can alter trade demand. Piracy can turn profitable waters uncertain. An earthquake can crack storage facilities and damage quays. A single major storm season can erase years of investment. The Bronze Age world often looks glorious because we meet it through frescoes, goldwork, seal stones, and the remnants of large buildings, but beneath that beauty lies a constant negotiation with risk. Scholars still debate how resilient these networks truly were, yet what survives in the record suggests they were both sophisticated and vulnerable, capable of long endurance and sudden shock. Islands occupy a special place in this system. They are stepping stones and choke points, safe havens and exposed targets. Control an island with a good harbour and fresh water, and one controls far more than a patch of land. One controls timing, access, shelter and movement. This is why island societies can become wealthy beyond what their size might suggest. They gather traffic, they mediate exchange, they accumulate influence because everyone passing through must reckon with them. But that same centrality makes them dangerous places to lose. An island struck by catastrophe does not vanish alone. It takes roots, expectations, and dependencies down with it. The Aegean is especially suited to producing powerful maritime cultures because it is a sea of fragments. Its islands are numerous, its channels short enough for regular travel, its horizons full of visible destinations. It rewards seamanship and local knowledge. It teaches people to think in chains of movement rather than in isolated territories. To later land-based empires, islands can appear marginal. In the Bronze Age Aegean, they are often central. The sea is not emptiness between places. It is the fabric holding places together. This is one reason the Atlantis tradition, with its emphasis on a mighty island power, has long felt intuitively Mediterranean, even when Plato places it farther away. The image of wealth ships and sudden maritime ruin belongs naturally to this world. One lesser known but revealing detail about Bronze Age seafaring is that it was not some primitive sideline. Cargoes could be highly organised and astonishingly varied. The famous late Bronze Age shipwreck found off Uluburun, though later than the height of early Minoan power, gives a vivid sense of what these networks could carry. Raw materials, luxury items, glass ingots, resins, finished goods and objects from multiple cultural spheres all travelling in one vessel. It is a floating summary of interconnectedness. A ship like that is commerce, diplomacy, prestige, and technical coordination in wooden form. It also reminds us how much of this world moved on water, and how much could be lost there without leaving easy traces. Within this maritime setting, Crete stands out. Minoan influence reaches across islands and into the imagination of later Greeks, who remember Crete as wealthy, old, and strangely powerful. Its art favours fluid forms, marine life ritual scenes, bright colour, and a confidence that suggests not isolation, but reach. Minoan pottery appears far beyond Crete. Architectural and administrative practices spread. There is still debate over how centralised or imperial this power really was, and the evidence remains incomplete, but the overall impression is unmistakable. Here is a sea-oriented civilization capable of commanding attention across the Aegean. Here is a culture prosperous enough, refined enough, and visible enough that if disaster struck it on a grand scale, the memory could travel. and disaster is never far away in this region. The eastern Mediterranean sits within a tectonically active zone. Earthquakes are part of its long rhythm. Volcanic islands rise from its submerged fractures. Tsunami risk is real, even if infrequent. Harbours silt. Coasts shift. Settlements burn and rebuild. The Bronze Age world does not float atop stable foundations. It rests on moving crust beneath unpredictable seas. That does not mean every historical crisis must be explained by geology, and no single explanation fully accounts for the upheavals of the age. War trade disruption, internal conflict and political change all matter. But natural catastrophe is not an exotic addition to this story. It is part of the baseline. This is what makes the search for a historical shadow behind Atlantis more than a game of matching motifs. In a world like this, there really are island societies rich enough to inspire awe, connected enough to matter widely, and vulnerable enough to suffer disproportionate consequences when nature turns violent. There are real places where memory might preserve a sequence of prosperity shock fragmentation and later embellishment. Not an empire ruling the ocean in the way later fantasy prefers, but something more plausible and perhaps more haunting. A maritime culture so visible in its time that its injury became unforgettable even after its exact contours blurred. The Bronze Age Mediterranean also gives us an important warning. Collapse rarely looks simple from the inside. It is easy from a great distance to compress events into a single moral arc-rise arrogance destruction. Real societies fray in more complicated ways. They absorb blows unevenly. Some towns recover while others do not. Trade continues in one corridor while failing in another. A palace burns and is rebuilt. A harbour is damaged and then reused. Memory, however, prefers cleaner patterns. That is where legend begins to diverge from history. A region of instability becomes one fallen kingdom. A series of disruptions becomes one terrible day. A network of island communities becomes one name. Still, the atmosphere in which such a name could grow is now in place. The sea lanes are busy, the islands are rich, the palaces hum with stored grain, perfumed oil, crafted goods, and ritual life. Ships pass between coasts carrying metals, stories, and obligations. Everything appears connected, and therefore everything is exposed. Somewhere within this brilliant island world lies the next stage of the mystery, a volcanic landscape beautiful enough to thrive, dangerous enough to erupt, and famous enough that when it breaks, the echo may continue for centuries. Before it is ever imagined as a clue to Atlantis, Santorini is simply an island with a wound in the middle. Today that wound is impossible to miss: a broken ring of steep volcanic cliffs surrounding a flooded caldera, the sea filling the place where part of the island once stood. But in the Bronze Age, before the Great Eruption, the landscape is different. There is still a volcano here, still danger written into the ground, but the island is fuller, more continuous, and in some ways more inviting than the shattered shape modern visitors know. This is ancient Thera, or rather the volcanic complex from which later Thera emerges, a place formed by repeated eruptions and long intervals of uneasy beauty. It sits in the southern Aegean like a gate between worlds, close enough to Crete to matter, central enough to movement that no serious maritime culture could ignore it. The first impression ancient sailors would have had is not of doom, but of usefulness. The island occupies a strategic position along routes linking Crete, the Cyclades, the Greek mainland, and the eastern Mediterranean beyond. It offers anchorage access and visibility. In a sea where timing and shelter matter, those are not minor advantages. A volcanic island can also be surprisingly fertile in places its soils renewed by ash, and mineral-rich deposits good for vines and other crops, when the land is stable enough to use. The same geology that makes such a place dangerous can also make it productive. This is one of nature's oldest bargains. Life grows well in the shadow of future ruin. By the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, the settlement now known as Akrotiri flourishes on the island. Calling it a town almost undersells its sophistication. Excavations reveal a substantial urban centre laid out with a confidence that speaks of planning, wealth, and technical competence. Multi-storey buildings rise along organised streets. There are workshops, storage areas, drainage systems, and evidence of lively exchange. Frescoes still preserve flashes of the culture's visual world, ships moving in procession, landscapes full of lilies and swallows, monkeys, fishermen, elegantly dressed figures and scenes, whose meanings are not always clear, but whose craftsmanship leaves no doubt about the settlement's refinement. Akrotiri is not a crude outpost clinging to volcanic rock. It is a place deeply embedded in the high maritime culture of its time. One of the most striking details about Akrotiri is how modern it can feel in fragments. Some buildings have elaborate drainage systems and toilets connected to channels, practical urban features that remind us how advanced certain Bronze Age communities could be. Rooms are arranged with care. Storage jars and workspaces suggest managed production rather than casual subsistence. The surviving frescoes reveal not only technical skill, but a society invested in display ceremony and visual coherence. Scholars still debate the exact political relationship between Akrotiri and Minoan Crete. The settlement shows strong Minoan cultural influence, yet the evidence remains incomplete on whether it was directly controlled, loosely aligned, or simply participating in the same broader Aegean sphere. What survives in the record suggests a community that is both connected and distinctive, not a mere provincial imitation. Its prosperity depends on the sea as much as any Bronze Age island centre. Goods come and go, knowledge travels, styles circulate. Crews and merchants carry more than cargo. They carry habits, stories, rituals, and expectations. The famous miniature ship fresco from Akrotiri, though still debated in interpretation, hints at a world intensely aware of maritime movement and ceremonial display. Ships are not marginal in this society. They are part of how the community imagines itself. That matters because when an island culture tied so closely to seafaring is struck by disaster, the resulting trauma is not confined to local loss. It tears at identity itself. Yet even before the Great Eruption, there are signs that this is not a stable paradise in the simple sense. The island exists because of volcanic violence, and the land bears that history in layers. Ash deposits from earlier eruptions lie buried beneath later life. The ground can shake. Thermal activity is part of the broader environment. People living here may not know when the next major eruption will come, but they do not inhabit innocent terrain. They live with a mountain that has destroyed before and can destroy again. Ancient communities are often good at normalizing this kind of risk. Familiar danger becomes background. Fields are tilled. Houses are built. Children grow up. Trade continues. The volcano remains part of the horizon until suddenly it becomes the whole story. This tension between brilliance and fragility is what makes prehistoric Thera so compelling in the Atlantis discussion. It is not merely that a sophisticated island settlement exists on a volcano. It is that the place embodies the exact contradiction at the heart of many catastrophe memories. Here is wealth in a dangerous setting. Here is beauty resting on a mechanism of annihilation. Here is a human world complex enough to impress later imaginations and vulnerable enough to vanish dramatically. No serious historian can simply equate Akrotiri with Plato's Atlantis. The chronology, geography, and literary framing are more complicated than that, but the resemblance in atmosphere is hard to ignore. A prosperous island centre linked to a powerful maritime civilization, erased by a cataclysm whose effects spread across the Aegean, is precisely the kind of reality that can nourish legend. There is another haunting detail. Unlike many destroyed ancient sites, Akrotiri appears in some ways to have been abandoned before the final blast. Archaeologists have found remarkably few human remains in the town compared with what might be expected from a sudden mass death. This suggests the inhabitants may have had warning perhaps from earthquakes or smaller precursor eruptions and fled before the culminating event. Scholars still debate the details, but the absence is eloquent. It points to a sequence rather than a single instant tremors, fear, evacuation, return perhaps by a few, then overwhelming destruction. The disaster may have unfolded across days or longer, with dread preceding obliteration. This is often how real catastrophe works. It approaches in stages, allowing just enough time for terror to develop before certainty arrives. The island before the ruin, then, is not a mythic ideal, but something more useful to history and more unsettling to imagine. Streets alive with work, painted rooms catching light, warehouses filled, boats drawn up, fields cultivated on soil created by earlier eruptions. Children who know the sea routes by name, adults who trust the harbour, trust the season, trust tomorrow, because most tomorrows have come as expected. The volcano sits there as it has sat before a presence, but not yet a verdict. Underneath, pressure accumulates. If Atlantis is in any sense a memory of real disaster, this is the kind of place where that memory could begin to take shape, not in boundless fantasy, but in a tangible Bronze Age world at the height of its confidence. The island does not need to be the Atlantis of Plato in a literal sense to matter. It needs only to show that the ancient Mediterranean truly produced places whose destruction was so severe, so spectacular, and so hard to forget that later generations might transform them into something larger than themselves. Thera before the eruption is one of the places. It is alive enough to be loved, rich enough to be remembered, and unstable enough to be lost. It does not begin with the explosion people remember. The great volcanic disasters of history rarely do. They begin with a change in mood, a shift in the ordinary grammar of the landscape. The ground trembles more often than it should. Walls complain. Dust falls from beams. Water behaves strangely in wells and cisterns. Animals grow restless. People who have spent their entire lives treating the island as home begin, however reluctantly, to imagine that home may no longer be safe. On prehistoric Thera, the evidence suggests that the final catastrophe is preceded by warning. Earthquakes almost certainly come first. Buildings at Akrotiri show signs of seismic damage, and repair or clearing activity before the eruption's terminal phase buries the town. What survives in the record suggests not a single theatrical instant, but a tightening sequence in which fear has time to spread before destruction becomes total. That makes the event more human and in some ways more terrifying. A sudden death leaves little room for dread. A disaster that announces itself forces people to live inside anticipation. The island shakes. Cracks open in plaster. Objects fall. Families weigh whether to stay near possessions or move toward boats. Traders who have weathered ordinary tremors may tell themselves this is another passing disturbance. Others may already be preparing to leave. Scholars still debate the exact timeline between the precursory earthquakes and the climactic eruption, and the evidence remains incomplete. But the pattern fits what volcanology often reveals elsewhere. Large eruptions can be preceded by escalating unrest enough to unsettle a population long before the main violence begins. Then the volcano breaks open. The eruption of Thera, usually dated to the later 17th or perhaps early 16th century BCE, depending on the chronology preferred, is one of the largest volcanic events of the Bronze Age, and likely among the most powerful eruptions in the human history of the Mediterranean. There are still debates over the precise date and sequence, because radiocarbon evidence, archaeological synchronisms, and Egyptian chronology have not always aligned neatly, but the scale of the event itself is not in doubt. This is not a local outburst. It is a regional catastrophe. Magma rich in gas rises under immense pressure. The volcano vents violently, hurling ash pumice and fragmented rock high into the atmosphere. Columns tower upward, unstable and monstrous, then collapse. Pyroclastic flows race outward. The island's structure begins to fail. To imagine it properly, one has to resist the neat cross-sections of textbooks. The lived experience would have been confusion, darkness, concussion noise beyond any ordinary storm, and a sky suddenly made hostile. Ash begins to fall first, perhaps as drifting dust, then more heavily whitening roofs, loading beams, choking air. Daylight is turned strange. The sea itself may behave unnaturally, disturbed by explosions, collapsing material, and the displacement of water. Lightning flashes within the eruption column, not as a thunderstorm people understand, but as electrical violence born from ash and friction. Breathing becomes difficult. Sight narrows. The horizon disappears into moving grey. On nearby coasts, people who cannot see the island clearly may still hear the explosions and watch the sky deform. One lesser-known detail about eruptions of this kind is how many distinct killing mechanisms they contain. Popular imagination tends to focus on lava, perhaps because lava is visible and cinematic. But for explosive eruptions, lava is often the least immediate threat to human populations. Far deadlier are ashfall collapsing roofs, pyroclastic density currents, toxic air-flying debris, and the cascading failures that follow. A town does not need to be touched by molten rock to be erased. It can be buried, suffocated, crushed, or abandoned into ruin. Akrotiri itself is preserved beneath volcanic deposits in a way that makes its destruction archaeologically legible, but that preservation is simply the beautiful afterlife of devastation. At some point in the eruptive sequence, the volcano can no longer support its own emptied interior. The central part of the island complex collapses inward, creating or enlarging the caldera that defines Santorini today. Enormous masses of material are displaced. This is one reason the eruption has been so compelling in Atlantis discussions. The image of an island broken apart by convulsion, part of it effectively lost to the sea, has an undeniable resemblance to later tales of land disappearing catastrophically. Yet resemblance is not identity. No single explanation fully accounts for the Atlantis story, and Plato's narrative is shaped by literary goals of his own. Still, here in the Bronze Age, Aegean is a real event capable of producing exactly the kind of cultural shock that legend feeds upon fire from the earth darkness at noon-sea disturbance, and the transformation of a flourishing island into a scarred remnant. The tsunamis likely generated by the eruption deepen that shock. Their precise size and timing at different locations are still matters of scientific reconstruction and debate, but there is broad agreement that major sea surges strike surrounding coasts. Waves do not announce themselves with mythic grandeur. Often the water first does something wrong. It draws back. It exposes what should not be exposed. Harbours empty or twist with violent current. People move closer instead of farther, trying to understand. Then the sea returns as force rather than surface. Boats are lifted and smashed. Quays are shattered. Low-lying settlements are inundated. Salt water pushes inland, carrying debris, mud wreckage, and bodies. For communities around the Aegean, the eruption is not only a distant volcanic spectacle. It becomes an assault delivered by water. There is an irony here that only deepens the historical power of the event. The same maritime world that allows Thera to prosper also helps spread the news of its destruction. Survivors flee by sea, traders carry reports. Neighbouring islands witness the ash cloud, the floating pumice, the abnormal waves, the interruption of routes. A catastrophe on an island at the centre of networks becomes a story with exceptional transmission. People far from the caldera may never see the island again in its former shape, but they hear enough to imagine the rest. This is how memory expands. The disaster is both witnessed and retold, both observed and embroidered, gaining scale as it crosses water. Even the deposits left behind would have fed ore. Pumice floats, ash settles in layers, fields are contaminated, coastlines bear strange new wreckage. A place known for life and movement becomes associated with blankness, burial, and absence. The evidence remains incomplete on the precise experience of every community affected, but the overall picture is severe enough without exaggeration. This is a genuine ancient catastrophe of the first order, one that destroys a flourishing settlement, disrupts a wider region, and alters the physical shape of an island in a way visible for generations afterward. So the day the volcano breaks is not one moment but a chain of unbearable recognitions. First, the ground cannot be trusted, then the sky, then the sea, then finally the map itself. A place that existed in one form no longer exists in that form. For those who live through it or inherit its consequences, the distinction between geology and story begins to thin. They do not need the language of Atlantis to understand that a rich island world has suffered something close to annihilation. They need only memory, fear, and time. Centuries later, when philosophers and poets shape older fragments into grander narratives, this is the kind of event that remains available to be transformed, not because it already is the legend, but because it is powerful enough to survive inside one. The eruption does not end at the rim of the volcano. Catastrophe on a maritime crossroads never stays local for long. Once there, ruptures, the damage radiates outward through sea lanes, coastlines, economies, and imagination, reaching places that never see the island directly, and yet still suffer because of it. This is where the event begins to resemble the kind of disaster that can enter collective memory on a much wider scale. A village buried under ash is tragic. A whole regional system shaken by violence from earth and sea is something else. It leaves witnesses in many places, each preserving a different piece of the same wound. The nearest islands would have felt the first secondary blows most sharply. Ashfall alone can be enough to cripple a community. Fine volcanic particles settle into water supplies, choke crops, foul grazing land, and make breathing difficult for people and animals alike. Thick deposits weigh on roofs and render fields useless until clearing is possible, if clearing is possible at all. Boats hauled up on shore may survive only to become irrelevant if harbours are damaged or if normal trade collapses. For small island communities with little margin for prolonged interruption, even a partial failure of water, food and movement can become life-threatening very quickly. Scholars still debate the exact distribution and thickness of ashfall across the wider Aegean, but the evidence remains clear that the eruption's footprint is regional rather than merely local. Then there is the sea itself, the medium that had carried prosperity now carrying shock. Tsunami deposits found in parts of the eastern Mediterranean suggest that powerful sea surges strike a number of coastlines, though the scale and reach remain matters of ongoing scientific reconstruction. On Crete, the question has been especially important because of the island's central role in the Minoan world. Northern coastal sites would have been particularly exposed to waves arriving from the direction of Thera. A harbour town does not need to be completely erased to suffer historical consequences. Quays, broken ships, lost storage areas, flooded with saltwater fishing gear, destroyed warehouses contaminated, and coastal roads damaged, can all amount to far more than temporary inconvenience. In a maritime society, these are injuries to circulation itself, Crete sits close enough, rich enough, and interconnected enough that any serious disruption there matters beyond the immediate shoreline. For generations, Minoan centres have thrived through their command of movement, exchange, craft production, and ritual prestige. Palaces such as Knossos have become symbols of coordination and abundance. Yet a palace economy depends on more than walls and ceremony. It depends on incoming goods, outgoing goods, predictable communication labour stability, and confidence in routes across water. If the eruption and its aftermath damage shipping, harbours, fields, and regional trust all at once, then even communities not physically obliterated may find themselves operating under new strain. What survives in the record suggests that the Minoan sphere continues after the eruption, but not unchanged and not untouched. This is one of the most important corrections to popular imagination. The eruption of Thera does not simply flip a switch and make the Minoan civilization vanish overnight. Real collapse is rarely that neat. Some sites continue, some recover, some adapt. Art and administration do not instantly cease. Archaeology almost never rewards stories that are too clean. Yet this does not make the eruption historically minor. A civilization can be weakened profoundly without disappearing at once. It can lose resilience. It can absorb a blow that leaves it more vulnerable to later shocks from warfare, internal rivalry, political takeover, or additional environmental stress. No single explanation fully accounts for what later happens in the Aegean, but large disasters often matter most in the way they reshape what a system can survive next. One lesser known but revealing feature of the post-eruption world is floating pumice. After major eruptions, great rafts or fields of pumice can drift on the sea, carried by currents and winds across wide distances. Ancient mariners encountering such material would have no trouble understanding that something extraordinary had happened. Harbours and shorelines receiving these strange stones from the water would bear a literal sign of the event long after the ash cloud dispersed. The sea becomes a messenger even in silence. It delivers fragments of the volcano to people who never saw the eruption column. That kind of physical reminder matters for memory. It is easier to retell catastrophe when it leaves debris in your hands. There may also have been climatic effects, at least for a time, though the extent and severity of these remain debated. Large eruptions can inject material into the atmosphere that influences sunlight, weather patterns, and agricultural conditions. In the case of Thera, researchers have long discussed whether the eruption produced noticeable short-term cooling or wider environmental stress beyond the immediate region. The evidence is still contested, and scholars remain cautious about linking every disturbance in this period directly to the volcano. Even so, ancient societies living close to subsistence thresholds do not need a dramatic global winter to suffer. Modest disruptions to growing seasons compounded with trade interruption and local devastation can be enough to produce hardship. For the people experiencing this, the distinction between direct and indirect damage would mean little. Whether a family loses relatives to a wave-seed grain to ash income to failed maritime exchange, or security to political instability that follows the result is the same, the world has become less dependable. This is how disasters move beyond geology into social life. They alter marriage patterns, migration decisions, storage practices, religious fears, and political calculations. They teach caution or desperation. They redistribute vulnerability. A great eruption is not just an event in nature. It is an event in memory, economy, and hierarchy. Crete especially becomes a place where these layers accumulate. The Minoan world has long attracted fascination because it appears so polished in its surviving art and architecture, almost serene in places with frescoes full of movement and ceremony rather than militaristic display. Yet beneath that elegance lies exposure. Coastal installations are vulnerable. Agricultural zones are finite. Palatial coordination can become a liability if central systems are damaged. Some archaeological evidence suggests destructions and transformations at various sites after the eruption, but the timing and causes do not always line up neatly enough to support simple conclusions. Scholars still debate how directly the Thera event contributes to later Minoan weakening and eventual Mycenaean ascendancy. The evidence remains incomplete, but the broad possibility is difficult to dismiss. A great maritime civilization may have taken a blow from which it did not immediately fall, yet never fully regained its former advantage. This gradual dimension may be exactly what helps such a disaster pass into legend. Immediate witnesses remember shock. Later generations remember decline without always remembering its mechanisms. A damaged harbour becomes part of a larger story about a kingdom no longer as strong as it was. A lost fleet becomes evidence that the sea turned against a people. A distant eruption becomes in retelling the destruction of an entire island power. Memory is not dishonest, it is selective. It compresses chains of cause and effect into images that can be carried. A wave smashing a port, a black cloud over the sea, a once prosperous island broken apart, these are the kinds of images that survive. So the shock waves across the Aegean are not only seismic or hydraulic, they're cultural. They move through rumour, ritual, fear, rebuilding and political opportunity. They reach communities already dependent on one another and remind them how quickly interdependence can become shared vulnerability. Long after the ash has settled and the sea has resumed its ordinary face, the region remains changed. Some places rebuild, others fade. Networks reroute. Power shifts. The volcano has done more than destroy a settlement. It has entered history as a force that rearranges the human map, leaving behind just enough evidence to convince just enough uncertainty to invite argument, and just enough scale to make legend almost inevitable. If Atlantis has any plausible historical shadow in the Bronze Age Aegean, it is here in the uneasy space between a real maritime civilization and a later story about one brought low by catastrophe. The Minoan world is not Atlantis in any simple sense. Its ruins do not match Plato's description point for point. Its chronology does not sit comfortably inside his numbers, and its political shape remains far more complex than the image of one single island empire ruling a vast realm. Yet when stripped of later fantasy and approached with caution, the resemblance becomes difficult to ignore in broad outline. Here is a wealthy, sea-oriented culture centered on islands and coastal influence. Here is a civilization famous for its sophistication, trade architecture, and command of maritime routes. Here is a world struck by one of the greatest natural disasters of the ancient Mediterranean, then weakened further over time until its former dominance is no longer what it was. That is not Atlantis proven, but it is exactly the kind of reality from which Atlantis-like memory could grow. The Minoans are especially compelling because they represent a form of power later societies would have remembered as both alluring and slightly alien. Their art architecture and administrative systems suggest a civilization of enormous refinement. Palaces at Knossos and elsewhere are not fortresses in the blunt style of many later strongholds. They are labyrinthine, theatrical, full of storage rooms, courts, shrines, workshops, staircases, and ceremonial spaces that feel designed as much for management and display as for defense. Frescoes present processions, nature athletic rituals, and marine life, with a confidence that seems to belong to a society long accustomed to wealth. Even the later Greek memory of Crete preserves a strange mixture of admiration and unease, wisdom, antiquity, sea power palaces, kings, and dangerous brilliance. It is the kind of cultural afterimage that easily attracts legend. At the same time, Minoan civilization is not preserved in a way that lets us narrate its fall with easy certainty. There is no single surviving text from the Minoans themselves explaining what they feared, how they interpreted the eruption of Thera, or whether they saw it as a mortal blow. Their still undeciphered script Linear A remains one of the quiet frustrations of Aegean archaeology. This is a crucial limitation. The evidence remains incomplete, not because the civilization was minor, but because its own voice is largely closed to us. We reconstruct from buildings, pottery frescoes, distribution patterns, destruction layers, imported goods, and later Greek echoes. That means every argument about memory and collapse must remain careful. The silence of the archive is part of the mystery. Still, certain patterns stand out. After the Thera eruption, the Minoan world continues, but signs of strain and transformation accumulate. Some sites show destruction, others show continuity. Networks adjust. Eventually, by the later Bronze Age, Mycenaean influence from mainland Greece becomes much more visible on Crete, including in administrative writing through Linear B, a script used for an early form of Greek. Scholars still debate exactly how this transition unfolds. Was Minoan power already significantly weakened by natural disaster, leaving it vulnerable to outside domination? Did internal political fragmentation open the way? Were the Mycenaeans opportunistic, aggressive, or simply inheritors of a system already changing from within? No single explanation fully accounts for the sequence, but the possibility that the eruption helped alter the balance of power remains compelling. This is where memory becomes more important than literal correspondence. A civilization does not need to be annihilated in one night to be remembered as having fallen in one. What later generations often preserve is not the slow administrative unraveling or the uneven regional pattern of destruction. They preserve the turning point. They preserve the moment the old certainty breaks. For the Minoan sphere, the eruption of Thera may have been exactly that kind of moment, whether or not it directly caused every later loss. A maritime culture can absorb wars, rivalries, and local setbacks. But when the sea itself becomes a route for catastrophe, the psychological effect may be deeper than any single material loss. The old order begins to feel vulnerable in a new way. One lesser-known detail that strengthens this sense of remembered rupture is the uneven visibility of disaster in the archaeological record. Catastrophes rarely leave a neat signature. Reading collapse begins here. Instead, they scatter clues: a harbour deposit, a destruction layer, imported pottery shifting in pattern, rebuilt rooms, abandoned zones, administrative changes, later reuse of earlier centres. This scattered evidence is frustrating for anyone hoping to pin Atlantis to one clean event, but it is exactly what real cultural trauma looks like in deep time. Memory later smooths the rough edges. History at the time is messier. There is also the symbolic power of islands to consider. A sea-based culture centered on islands carries a special vulnerability in human imagination. Islands feel self-contained, bounded complete. When they are damaged or partly destroyed, the loss appears total even when it is not. A mainland kingdom can retreat inland, redistribute population, and still appear territorially coherent. An island system struck by eruption, ashfall and wave damage feels like a world broken at its core. For people in later centuries hearing inherited stories about old seafaring powers, it would be natural to imagine such a civilization as having been swallowed whole, even if the historical reality involved prolonged weakening rather than instant disappearance. This may also help explain why Atlantis, though shaped into a moral tale by Plato, carries such strong emotional plausibility. The image of a rich island civilization punished by sudden destruction resonates because the ancient Mediterranean really had known island societies whose fortunes were astonishing and whose vulnerability was real. Crete and the wider Minoan sphere are not fantasy projections backward from the classical world. They are concrete evidence that highly organized maritime cultures flourished long before Plato wrote, and that some of them were touched by forces dramatic enough to echo for centuries. What survives in the record suggests not a lost super-civilization beyond all comparison, but a very real Bronze Age brilliance that later ages only partly understood. That partial understanding may be the key. Later Greeks remember Crete through mythic fragments, Minos labyrinths, tribute sea power, strange old authority. They do not remember the Minoans as archaeologists would describe them, because archaeology does not yet exist, and direct continuity has long since blurred. Instead, they inherit a cultural silhouette. It is old, it is island-based, it is powerful, it is associated with exceptional architecture and maritime influence. It belongs to a time already difficult to access. Into that silhouette, memories of natural catastrophe could easily flow. A shattered island in the south, stories of fire and waves, older recollections of decline all gathering around the broad prestige of a vanished age. This is why the Minoans matter so much in responsible discussions of Atlantis. Not because they solve the mystery in a neat, satisfying way, but because they show how a legend can be nourished by history without being reducible to it. The Atlantis of Plato is too literary to collapse into one archaeological label. Yet the Minoan world offers a believable human substrate beneath the legend, a maritime civilization of great wealth and visual splendor, touched by geological catastrophe, transformed over generations and preserved in later memory only in fragments grand enough to invite enlargement. So when people speak of Atlantis as a lost civilization, the most credible ancient reality behind that phrase may not be a vanished empire waiting under the Atlantic at all. It may be the memory of a sea-dominant Bronze Age world whose confidence was broken, whose islands became associated with disaster, and whose former greatness remained visible only as ruins, stories, and inherited unease. The Minoans do not give us Atlantis as a destination. They give us Atlantis as a process, prosperity shock weakening reinterpretation myth. That is a more restrained answer than legend wants, but perhaps a deeper one. The lost island is not found, it is remembered into existence. Once a disaster passes out of direct witness, it begins to change shape. This is true of battles, plagues, famines, and dynastic murders, but it is especially true of environmental catastrophe, because the landscape itself becomes both evidence and distortion. A harbour silts up and later generations assume it was always small. A broken island becomes normal to those born after the event. A ruined palace is quarried for stone and enters memory as something older, stranger, and less specific than it once was. The facts do not vanish immediately. They loosen. They stop being anchored to the people who first experienced them. In that loosening, memory becomes inventive without necessarily becoming false. It is trying to preserve emotional truth after practical detail has decayed. This is where Atlantis becomes more plausible as a memory than as a map. Human communities are very good at carrying the outline of terror forward, long after chronology, geography, and proportion have begun to blur. They remember that a prosperous place was destroyed. They remember that the sea was involved. They remember fire, darkness, upheaval, and a people once strong brought low. What they may not remember several centuries later is exactly which island, which harbour, which ruler, which generation, or which sequence of causes belong to the event. Scholars still debate how reliably oral traditions can preserve deep time material, and the evidence remains incomplete, but there's little doubt that extreme events can leave cultural residues far more durable than everyday facts. Routine administration is forgotten first. Catastrophe stays. That staying power, however, comes at a cost. Memory compresses. A series of related shocks becomes one disaster. Regional collapse becomes the destruction of a single kingdom. An interconnected maritime sphere becomes one great island power. A culture remembered only in fragments is given sharper edges than it ever truly possessed. This is not necessarily deliberate exaggeration. It is how narrative works. Stories survive because they simplify without entirely severing their bond to experience. The world of the Bronze Age Aegean, with its multiple islands, shifting routes, layered destructions, and long afterlife in Greek memory, would have been especially vulnerable to this kind of compression. Too much happened over too long a period for later generations to preserve it in analytic form. But a tale of a mighty island civilization ruined by sea and earth that could travel. There is also the matter of prestige. Communities do not usually preserve the destruction of insignificant places in grand mythic form. Memory gravitates toward what was once important, admired, feared, or symbolically rich. That is one reason possible historical substrates for Atlantis tend to cluster around the Minoan sphere and other major maritime settings rather than around small forgotten settlements, however tragic their individual losses may have been. A catastrophe affecting an influential island culture would not remain local in memory. It would be retold by trading partners, rivals, migrants, descendants, and later peoples who built their own identities partly in relation to what had come before. The more prestigious the lost world, the more myth can attach to it. And prestige changes scale. A prosperous island becomes a great island. A sea network becomes dominion over many lands. A palace centre becomes a capital of extraordinary design. A remembered elite becomes a civilization of immense splendour. There is a familiar human logic in this. Distance enlarges. The remote past becomes grander because its exact measurements are gone. Later ages often imagine former powers as larger and more unified than they really were, especially when those powers have already passed into semi-legendary status. Plato, writing in a classical Greek world that looks back on much older Bronze Age societies, through fragments and inherited stories, is perfectly positioned to receive and intensify that enlargement. One lesser-known feature of oral and cultural memory is that moral meaning often attaches itself most strongly to events that were originally just destructive. A volcanic eruption has no ethics. A tsunami is not a judgment. But communities rarely leave such events morally empty for long. They ask why this happened to us or why it happened there and not here. Over time, an environmental disaster becomes a warning against pride, excess, impiety, softness, greed, or forgotten obligations. The moral layer does not erase the event underneath. It settles over it like ash. This helps explain why Plato's Atlantis can simultaneously feel like a philosophical allegory and something older than allegory. He may be applying a moral architecture to materials that already carried inherited dread. Centuries of retelling also change location. A story can drift geographically without losing its emotional core. A flood remembered on one coastline may later be placed in a more distant, more dramatic setting. An island in the Aegean can become in literary imagination a power beyond the Pillars of Heracles if that placement better suits the scale of the narrative or the contrast Plato wants to draw between worlds. Ancient storytellers are not bound by modern expectations of cartographic precision. They work with symbolic geography as well as real geography. Near and Far East and West Centre and Edge all carry meaning. No single explanation fully accounts for Plato's placement of Atlantis, but relocation in service of narrative grandeur would not be unusual. There is another transformation that often happens in long memory, the shift from process to event. The weakening of the Minoan world, for example, is historically a complicated sequence. It involves eruption, regional disruption recovery in some areas, later destructions, changing power balances, and eventual Mycenaean dominance. That is far too untidy for legend. Legend wants a hinge. It wants the before and the after separated by one comprehensible break. So history that unfolds over generations is remembered as having happened in a day and a night. This is not because the descendants are foolish. It is because narrative prefers turning points. Humans can carry one night across 1,000 years more easily than they can carry a century of cumulative stress. The sea encourages this simplification because it hides duration. A city ruined on land can show layers of rebuilding and abandonment. A place lost to water offers fewer visible stages. It is there, and then it is not. The imagination fills the gap with abruptness. Even where the actual history involved evacuation, aftershocks, trade, disruption, secondary collapse, and gradual political change, the water creates the illusion of one clean removal. This is part of why Atlantis remains such a powerful image. The sea does not merely destroy, it edits. By the time Plato records the story, then the raw event or events behind Atlantis, if there were such events, would already have passed through many acts of shaping. Witness memory becomes communal memory. Communal memory becomes inherited tradition. Tradition becomes moralized narrative. Narrative becomes philosophical material. At each stage, something is lost and something is gained. Exact detail fades. Symbolic power increases. The island becomes more coherent than history ever was. The destruction becomes more final. The lesson becomes clearer. Yet beneath the polish, a residue may still remain, a real awareness that flourishing maritime worlds had once suffered terrible ends. This is why Atlantis should perhaps be imagined not as one transmission, but as a layered composition. Rising seas from older prehistory, volcanic catastrophe in the Bronze Age, memories of island decline. Greek fascination with older civilizations and Plato's own political imagination may all be present in different proportions. What survives in the record suggests no single source neat enough to settle the question. But that very messiness is what makes the idea persuasive. Legends that endure for millennia are often strongest when they are fed by more than one stream of memory. So the story changes by centuries because it must. To survive, it becomes simpler, larger, more moral, and more portable. A real disaster is too tangled to endure untouched. But once it has been refined into a tale of a rich island power destroyed by the combined violence of earth and sea, it can travel far beyond its original coast. It can be retold in cities that never saw the eruption, in schools that never knew the palaces, in philosophical dialogues that no longer remember the names of the dead. And in that retelling, Atlantis becomes what many ancient memories eventually become, not history exactly, but history after it has passed through the human need to make loss meaningful. Atlantis becomes even harder to pin down once it is placed beside the many other stories human beings tell about water taking the world away. The ancient imagination is full of drowned land, swallowed towns, and great floods that arrive as punishment, correction, memory, or simple terror. Mesopotamia preserves flood traditions long before the classical Greeks write about Atlantis. The Hebrew Bible carries its own version of a world-cleansing deluge. Greek myth includes destructive inundations of different kinds. Beyond the Mediterranean and Near East, countless other cultures preserve stories in which sea or river rises beyond its place and rearranges human life with overwhelming force. This wide distribution does not prove that every tradition points to one event. In fact, the opposite is more likely. Flood stories recur because coasts shift, because rivers destroy, because tsunamis happen, and because water has always been one of the most universal agents of human loss. That wider pattern matters because it prevents Atlantis from becoming too special in the wrong way. There is a strong temptation, especially in modern popular culture, to treat Atlantis as the master key to all ancient flood memories, as though every submerged coast and every tale of inundation must lead back to one lost civilization. The evidence does not support that. Scholars still debate how particular flood traditions formed what events they may preserve, and how much they owe to literary borrowing versus local memory. No single explanation fully accounts for why stories of watery destruction appear so widely. Some are tied to river systems, some may preserve coastal inundation, some are primarily theological or moral narratives, others may blend several layers at once. The important point is not that Atlantis explains them all, but that Atlantis belongs to a much older human habit of remembering that water can erase the familiar. Seen in that company, Atlantis begins to look less like an anomaly, and more like a regional variant with distinctive features. Unlike a total flood story that destroys nearly all humanity, Atlantis focuses on a particular island power. Unlike simple local legends of a drowned village, it operates at the scale of civilization. Unlike purely sacred deluges, it comes wrapped in political and philosophical meaning. Yet it shares with many other traditions a core emotional grammar. A place once inhabited is gone. The boundary between land and water has failed, and the destruction becomes a moral or civilizational lesson, as well as a physical memory. That combination of local realism and symbolic enlargement is common in the afterlife of disaster. The Mediterranean itself offers several candidates for comparison beyond Thera. There are ancient and later traditions about cities punished or overwhelmed by the seacoasts altered by earthquakes and harbours lost or changed beyond easy recognition. Greek and Roman writers note places where the land rises or sinks, where temples end up closer to the water than before, where earthquakes open the ground or trigger destruction along coasts. In some cases, archaeology confirms that such changes were not imaginary. Ports silt up, earthquakes damage coastal settlements, parts of cities subside. While none of these examples alone create Atlantis, they show that the classical world lives with a real awareness that land is not fixed, and that maritime catastrophe belongs to plausible experience. A story of an island power lost to water does not need to be invented against the grain of reality. It grows naturally from a world already acquainted with instability. One lesser-known but intriguing comparison comes from drowned prehistoric landscapes that only modern archaeology has begun to recover. Across parts of Europe, the Mediterranean and beyond, there are now known or suspected paleo-landscapes beneath present seas, where people once moved, hunted, settled, or gathered resources. Some of these drowned worlds are associated with legends in later folklore, though the connection is usually impossible to prove cleanly. What matters is the pattern. Human memory often lingers around places that have become physically inaccessible. Once a landscape is gone beneath water, it becomes ideal ground for story. It cannot easily be checked. It can only be recalled, described, lamented, or mythologized. The sea keeps just enough of the truth to make the fiction believable. This is also where the idea of other lost lands becomes both useful and dangerous. It is useful because it reminds us that ancient people were not irrational to imagine land now absent. Such things really happened. It is dangerous because modern imagination loves to gather all lost places into one giant hidden map of forgotten civilization. That impulse often leads away from history and into fantasy. Submerged prehistoric plains, tsunami-damaged coasts, tectonically altered islands, and literary flood traditions do not automatically converge into one master narrative. They belong to different times, different settings, and different cultural needs. What survives in the record suggests a mosaic of losses rather than a single vanished world. Even so, mosaics can still feed legend. A story like Atlantis may draw strength precisely because it resonates with many kinds of memory at once. Rising seas from deep prehistory provide a long background of drowned coasts. Bronze Age disasters provide dramatic, island-specific catastrophes. Near Eastern flood traditions show how inundation can become moral literature. Greek storytelling adds local geography, political reflection, and older cultural echoes from places like Crete. By the time Plato shapes Atlantis into its surviving literary form, the story may be powerful not because it derives from one source only, but because it sits at the crossroads of several ancient habits of remembering watery loss. That helps explain why Atlantis has always felt both singular and familiar. It is singular because the details are so vivid: the island power, the concentric capital, the war with ancient Athens, the sudden destruction. It is familiar because the emotional foundation is one humans already know intimately. The sea has taken land before. Prosperity has ended suddenly before. Sacred or proud communities have seen themselves humbled before. Catastrophe has always been turned into story before. Atlantis does not need to stand alone to endure. It endures because it joins a larger chorus. There is another subtle point here. Competing explanations for Atlantis need not be mutually exclusive in the simplistic way modern debate often assumes. A story can contain memories of drowned coastlines without being about post-Ice Age sea rise in any narrow sense. It can draw on the aura of Minoan or Theran catastrophe without being a direct historical report of Thera. It can borrow flood motifs familiar from other traditions without being reducible to them. Ancient narratives are rarely built like modern case files with one source and one conclusion. They are layered compositions. They absorb what cultures already know, fear, and find meaningful. The evidence remains incomplete, but that incompleteness may be a clue in itself. A legend that feels overdetermined may simply have more than one ancestor. So Atlantis, among other floods and other lost lands, becomes less a puzzle, with one missing piece, and more a meeting point. Here converge memories of shoreline instability, island catastrophe, political collapse, and the universal human need to turn overwhelming destruction into something transmissible. That does not solve Atlantis, but it changes the quality of the question. Instead of asking which single place is Atlantis, we begin to ask what kinds of real experiences make a story like Atlantis possible and durable. The answer is broader, older, and more unsettling than the treasure hunt version. The ancient world does not need one perfect lost island to explain the legend. It needs only a long history of water taking worlds one after another until memory itself begins to sound like myth. Modern archaeology enters the Atlantis story like a corrective, but not a simple one. It clears away fantasies in one place and opens new possibilities in another. Before archaeology, a lost city under the sea could remain almost entirely metaphorical, a matter of texts, speculation, and wishful geography. Once divers sonar sediment, coring underwater photography, and marine survey begin to reveal the drowned edges of the ancient world, the conversation changes. The sea is no longer just a blank surface onto which anything can be projected. It becomes an archive, difficult and partial but real. And what that archive shows is both less romantic and more astonishing than legend usually prefers. There are indeed ancient settlements beneath the water, There are harbours now drowned walls offshore, quays submerged, and paleo landscapes lost beneath later seas. Atlantis is not confirmed by any of this, but the basic idea that parts of the human past lie underwater is no longer speculative. It is an established fact. This matters because for centuries the search for Atlantis was often driven less by evidence than by longing. Explorers and enthusiasts pointed to vague ruins, curious rock formations, or grand geographic theories with little restraint. The ocean invited this kind of projection because it hid so much. Anything missing could be placed there. The Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, even Antarctica would all have their turn in the literature of hopeful misidentification. Serious archaeology works differently. It begins not with what one wishes to find, but with what sediments, ceramics, architectural patterns, dating methods, and context actually allow. The result is slower, less theatrical, and far more valuable. Underwater archaeology is one of the most technically demanding branches of the field because the sea preserves and destroys at the same time. A drowned harbour may survive in outline while its organic materials vanish. A storm can expose a structure one year and bury it the next. Visibility changes, currents interfere, sediment can shield remains from erosion or hide them completely. Excavation is expensive, dangerous, and often frustratingly limited. Scholars still debate the interpretation of many submerged sites because underwater context is rarely neat. What survives in the record suggests a world of partial recoveries rather than perfect revelations. The sea gives back pieces, not complete explanations. Even those pieces, however, are transformative. Around the Mediterranean and beyond, marine surveys have identified ancient ports, now below current sea level settlements, affected by subsident structures, drowned by tectonic movement, and coastlines drastically altered since antiquity. In some places, entire neighbourhoods have slipped beneath the water after earthquakes. In others, gradual sea level rise and coastal change have pushed older habitation zones offshore. These discoveries do not point to one single lost supercity. They point instead to a historical pattern the ancient world would have recognized instinctively. The line between land and sea is unstable over long stretches of time and sometimes unstable very quickly. One of the most useful lessons from underwater archaeology is how ordinary the beginnings of extraordinary loss can be. A harbour town is not built as a future mystery. It is built because the shoreline is practical, the bay protected, the route profitable. Then a quake strikes, a delta shifts, a coast subsides, or the sea creeps inland over centuries. The result later is a drowned site that feels dramatic to modern imagination, but was once simply part of ordinary life. This matters for Atlantis because it pulls the legend back toward the human scale. The past did not need one impossibly advanced vanished civilization to produce stories of submerged places. It needed many real coastal communities exposed to risk. At the same time, the underwater record also reveals how easily human beings can overread suggestive remains. Straight-looking lines on the seabed can be natural formations. Circular features that excite popular writers may turn out to be geological. Ancient masonry can belong to a modest harbour installation rather than a legendary capital. A submerged wall proves submergence, not Atlantis. This is one reason careful marine archaeologists are often less enthusiastic in public than the headlines that follow their work. Their findings are important precisely because they are precise. They know how much context matters. A stone feature without date, cultural material, and secure interpretation tells very little. The Mediterranean search has therefore tended to produce a paradox. The more we learn about drowned ancient landscapes, the less we need Atlantis as a literal explanation, and yet the more believable Atlantis becomes as a cultural response to real environmental loss. Discoveries around submerged ports and ancient coastlines show that the ancients really did inhabit places now underwater. Surveys around volcanic islands and tectonically active shores show that maritime catastrophe is not theoretical. Excavations at Akrotiri show a prosperous Bronze Age settlement buried by eruptions so dramatically that it still feels almost suspended in time. None of this identifies Plato's island directly. But together, these findings create a world in which the memory of a lost maritime society no longer sounds absurd. One lesser-known challenge in underwater work is that preservation biases what we find. Stone survives better than wood. Heavier materials stay where lighter ones move. Luxury architecture may be easier to detect than the dwellings of ordinary people. Harbours, quays, and monumental structures attract attention. Fisheries, seasonal camps, and less formal coastal sites can remain nearly invisible. This means the underwater past we recover is often skewed toward what was built substantially or deposited densely. Entire kinds of human activity may remain underrepresented. The evidence remains incomplete not only because the sea hides things, but because it filters them according to its own rough criteria. There is also the problem of time depth. A harbour submerged in late antiquity and a paleo coastline drowned millennia earlier are very different phenomena, though both may appear in popular writing under the same vague category of underwater ruins. Archaeology insists on separating them. Dates matter. Processes matter. A site submerged by tectonic subsidence after an earthquake belongs to a different history than one lost gradually after post-glacial sea rise. This disciplined separation is exactly what legend resists. Atlantis gathers many kinds of submergence into one narrative. Archaeology patiently pulls them apart again, and yet even after all that discipline, the lure remains. There is something about the underwater past that continues to press against the boundary between evidence and imagination. A diver moves over cut stone in green water where fish cross through what used to be a street or shrine. A sonar map hints at outlines under sediment. A volcanic bay conceals whole chapters of habitation. It is not difficult to see how, in earlier ages without our methods, such partial truths could grow into larger stories. The sea does not merely hide the past, it dramatizes it. This is the lasting contribution of the search beneath the water. It has not found Atlantis in the sensational way treasure hunters hoped. No concentric metropolis has risen from the seabed to vindicate literal readings of Plato, but archaeology has done something more useful. It has shown that the ancient world contains many real losses to water, many submerged margins, many drowned human spaces, and many opportunities for memory to detach from precise geography. It has shown that legend need not be measured only against total invention. Between fiction and fact lies a broad zone of transformed reality, and that zone is exactly where Atlantis still lives most plausibly. So the modern search beneath the water ends not with a triumphant discovery, but with a subtler recognition. The sea is full of history, though not the history people first went looking for. It holds proof that coastlines changed, settlements sank, harbours failed, and whole ways of life slipped beyond easy reach. Atlantis is still absent as a fixed destination, but the world that could have produced Atlantis has become steadily clearer. It is a world in which human beings really did lose places to the sea often enough and dramatically enough that one layered memory of such losses could survive for centuries and finally emerge in literature as something larger than any one ruin below the waves. Once Atlantis becomes famous, restraint almost immediately begins to fail. A story that starts in philosophical literature and may preserve echoes of real disaster soon attracts a different kind of imagination, one less interested in how memory works than in how magnificently it can be overstated. The result is a long history of theories that go too far, move too fast, and ask the evidence to do work it simply cannot do. In one age, Atlantis is placed in the Atlantic as a lost mother civilization. In another, it becomes the source of all major ancient achievements, as though Egyptians, Mesoamericans, Greeks, and everyone else required a vanished superior culture to explain their accomplishments. In still later versions, it is granted impossible technology, psychic powers, crystal energy aircraft, global colonies, or a wisdom so advanced that ordinary archaeology becomes almost irrelevant. These ideas are not just unsupported. They often reveal more about modern appetites than about the ancient world. One problem with fringe Atlantis theories is scale inflation. A plausible historical memory usually grows from a real event, a real region, or a real society, then becomes larger in retelling. Fringe theories reverse the process. They begin with a civilization so vast, so advanced, and so globally influential that it would have left unmistakable traces across multiple independent records. Such traces do not exist. There is no credible archaeological evidence for a worldwide Atlantean empire, no accepted corpus of inscriptions, no diagnostic material culture spread across continents that points to one hidden source, and no serious stratigraphic case for a technologically advanced Ice Age super-civilization. Scholars still debate many details of prehistory and early complex societies, but the broad outlines of ancient human development do not require a lost master culture to make sense. On the contrary, they make much better sense without one. Another problem is the habit of confusing coincidence, resemblance, and contact. Similar monuments in distant regions are often taken by fringe writers as proof of shared Atlantean origin, even when the similarities are broad and the differences much more revealing. Large stone architecture, flood myth, sun symbolism, or geometric planning do not automatically imply transmission from a vanished source. Human societies facing similar physical constraints often produce comparable solutions. Monumentality is not evidence of hidden teachers, nor is complexity evidence of external rescue. A great deal of Atlantis speculation quietly assumes that ancient peoples could not have achieved what archaeology shows they did unless someone even more advanced had first shown them how. That assumption is not only unsupported, it is often intellectually lazy, and in many cases dismissive of the real ingenuity of the cultures being discussed. The geography of these theories tends to be just as unstable as the logic. Atlantis has been placed in the mid-Atlantic, the Caribbean, the Azores, Spain, Morocco, Scandinavia, Antarctica, Indonesia, the Sahara, the Black Sea, and almost anywhere else a dramatic map can be drawn. Usually the proposed location is supported by selective quotation-exaggerated geological claims or the isolation of one suggestive feature from its context. A submerged bank becomes a continent. A local flood deposit becomes proof of civilization-wide annihilation. A circular landform becomes Plato's capital. The evidence remains incomplete in many areas of ancient environmental history, but incompleteness is not a license to insert whatever one likes. Responsible interpretation narrows possibilities. Fringe interpretation multiplies them until the story becomes impossible to falsify. One lesser-known clue that many of these theories are weak is how often they ignore chronology. Dates are the discipline of archaeology, and they are fatal to a surprising number of Atlantis claims. A site may be impressive, underwater, and ancient, yet still belong to the wrong millennium, or the wrong cultural setting entirely. Geological events may be dramatic, but far too early or too late to have plausible relevance to the traditions in question. Plato's own chronology is problematic enough without importing unrelated catastrophes from wildly different periods. When a theory survives only by sliding dates around whenever convenient, it is usually being protected from evidence rather than tested by it. Then there is the recurring appeal of hidden knowledge. Atlantis is often used as a container for everything people wish had once existed and then been denied by conventional history. Perfect wisdom, lost sciences, sacred geometry, with world-altering power, forgotten energy systems, secret initiatory traditions, or proof that our ancestors stood on the edge of modernity and then fell backward into darkness. The emotional attraction is obvious. Such theories flatter the believer by implying that the official story is too narrow and that truth survives in fragments available only to those willing to read past the accepted record. But emotionally satisfying theories are not the same as good ones. What survives in the record suggests a far more interesting reality. Ancient civilizations were indeed ingenious, but their ingenuity is legible through actual evidence, not through a missing civilization invented to sit above them all. Some fringe Atlantis narratives also feed on genuine scientific uncertainty in misleading ways. For example, because coastlines have changed dramatically since the Ice Age, it is true that many prehistoric sites are now submerged, and that our picture of coastal prehistory is incomplete. Because underwater archaeology is difficult, it is true that important discoveries still await. Because ancient disasters did happen, it is true that some myths may preserve echoes of them. None of these points, however, leads automatically to a hidden global civilization. Good historical reasoning is cumulative and proportionate. It moves from uncertainty to careful possibility, not from uncertainty to whatever sounds grandest. This does not mean every unconventional idea is worthless merely because it is unconventional. Archaeology advances partly by testing possibilities that once seemed improbable. Entire cities have been found where only texts hinted at them. Whole trade systems have been reconstructed from shipwrecks' tablets, an isotopic analysis in ways earlier scholars could not have imagined. But those advances happen through disciplined survey excavation dating, comparison, peer criticism, revision. They do not happen because a dramatic theory feels emotionally right. No single explanation fully accounts for Atlantis, and there is room for debate around memory, literary borrowing, geology, and cultural transformation. There is not room to ignore evidence whenever it becomes inconvenient. Perhaps the greatest weakness of exaggerated Atlantis theories is that they make the real story smaller by trying to make it bigger. A Bronze Age island settlement buried by volcanic catastrophe is extraordinary. A maritime civilization weakened by natural disaster and later remembered in myth is extraordinary. Prehistoric coastlines drowned by rising seas are extraordinary. The ancient world does not lack wonder. What fringe theories often add is not wonder but distortion. They flatten real complexity into a single melodramatic source, and in doing so lose the very texture that makes the past worth listening to. Plato's Atlantis endures not because it secretly unlocks every ancient mystery, but because it sits at the edge of several real mysteries at once. That is enough. It touches drowned landscapes, geological violence, lost scripts, vanished powers, and the fragility of memory. Once it is forced into the role of explaining pyramids, transoceanic contact in every direction, or advanced prehistoric technology, it becomes less persuasive, not more. The myth grows louder as the historical value drains away. So the theories that go too far serve one useful purpose. They clarify by contrast what a responsible approach looks like. It does not ask Atlantis to be the parent of civilization. It does not need crystals, antediluvian aircraft, or a vanished world government. It asks a narrower and more compelling question, whether a famous literary tale might preserve distorted memories of real, ancient disasters, and real maritime decline. That question remains alive because it is grounded. The others survive mostly because the sea invites projection and because absence is easy to decorate. But decorated absence is not history. The past deserves better than that, and it is more than strange enough without invention masquerading as proof. What survives longest after catastrophe is not always stone. Sometimes it is ritual. Sometimes it is a place name no one can fully explain anymore. Sometimes it is a taboo attached to a shoreline, a story told to children about where not to build, or a festival whose original meaning has drained away while the form remains. Human beings are often better at preserving danger culturally than they are at preserving it analytically. This is one reason the memory of disaster can endure across astonishing spans of time without remaining historically exact. It moves out of chronology and into habit. It settles into the moral imagination. It becomes part of how a people understands what the world is capable of doing. Anthropologists have long noticed that communities exposed to recurring environmental threats often encode those threats in story. Not because story is a primitive substitute for science, but because story is portable, memorable, and social. A warning embedded in narrative can survive where a technical explanation might not. The details may shift. Supernatural agents may enter. Moral meaning may be added. But underneath the story continues to perform work. It tells listeners that this river rises too fast, that this coast should not be trusted, that this mountain has erupted before, that this ground shook once and may shake again. Scholars still debate how deeply and accurately oral traditions can preserve specific events over very long periods, and the evidence remains incomplete. But there is little serious doubt that collective memory can carry environmental knowledge in forms that are not immediately obvious to later outsiders. This matters for Atlantis because the story's persistence may owe less to the exact survival of one ancient report than to its alignment with how human memory behaves after trauma. Extreme events are rarely remembered as neutral sequences of data. They are remembered through images of violation. The sea came where it should not have come. The mountain broke open. The sky turned dark. The land disappeared. The proud place fell. These are not just dramatic phrases. They are mnemonic anchors. They give shape to panic after the fact. They are the kinds of things survivors repeat because the raw event is too large to hold otherwise. Over time, the repeated image becomes more durable than the original setting. Psychology adds another layer. Traumatic memory is often fragmentary, vivid in some respects and distorted in others. It may preserve sensory force while losing order. A witness recalls the sound, the darkness, the wave, the running, the fire, but not the exact sequence or scale. At the level of communities rather than individuals, something similar can happen across generations. A society remembers the emotional logic of disaster before it remembers the event's full historical texture. That is why catastrophe stories so often feel simultaneously specific and unstable. They preserve intensity but not neat proportion. What survives in the record suggests that Atlantis belongs very comfortably in this category. It feels like an event remembered through the pressure it exerted, not through the precision of its documentation. One lesser-known feature of cultural memory is that it often relocates fear into sacred or symbolic geography. A dangerous place becomes wholly forbidden, cursed, or morally charged. Certain caves, coasts, mountains, and ruins acquire narratives that explain why they matter even when the original event that made them matter has faded. In some cases, these narratives are transparent inventions. In others, they may preserve a real historical wound in altered form. The sea especially lends itself to this process because it is already a liminal space, both root and barrier giver and taker. A drowned place quickly becomes more than drowned. It becomes a threshold between worlds, a site of judgment, memory, or warning. This helps explain why purely literal readings of Atlantis often miss the story's deeper durability. Its staying power may come not from being a hidden coordinate waiting on a map, but from functioning exactly as disaster memory often functions as compressed truth. The compression is important. A full historical explanation of a regional Bronze Age crisis would be too complex to pass cleanly through oral tradition and later philosophical use. But a tale of a rich island power destroyed by the combined violence of sea and earth, after growing morally swollen and overconfident, is memorable enough to endure. No single explanation fully accounts for why this particular form endured so strongly, yet its psychological efficiency is hard to ignore. It says in one image what generations of trauma decline and environmental fear might otherwise struggle to communicate. Anthropology also reminds us that memory is social before it is textual. Plato writes Atlantis down, but writing is only one stage in the life of a story. Before text comes transmission through families' ritual settings, public performance, cultural assumptions, inherited prestige, and the repeated retelling of things that seem too important to lose. By the time a tale reaches literature, it may already carry centuries of prior shaping. This is why the question of whether Atlantis is true can be too blunt to be useful. If by true one means a literal documentary account, the answer is almost certainly no. If by true one means a layered story preserving real perceptions of ancient vulnerability and perhaps real memories of catastrophic loss, the answer becomes much more interesting. There are modern examples that make this easier to understand. In different parts of the world, oral traditions have been studied that appear to preserve memories of eruptions, tsunamis, sea level change, or earthquakes long after the events themselves. The degree of accuracy varies, and scholars are rightly cautious about forcing correlations where evidence is weak. But the larger pattern is clear enough. Communities do carry environmental memory in narrative form. Sometimes the story preserves a surprisingly recognizable core. Sometimes it preserves only the warning. Sometimes the event and the moral fuse so completely that outsiders mistake the whole thing for pure invention. The evidence remains incomplete in every individual case, but the mechanism itself is well within the range of human cultural behavior. Atlantis then may endure because it speaks from that old human intersection where disaster becomes identity. A people that has survived catastrophe does not merely rebuild physically. It reorganizes meaning. It decides what the event says about gods, rulers, ancestors, and the landscape itself. It decides whether the disaster was random, deserved cyclical, or unprecedented. It decides what must be remembered so it does not happen again, or what must be remembered precisely because nothing can stop it happening again. In that sense, even a highly literary story like Plato's can draw power from deeper strata of remembered instability. He provides the philosophical frame, but the emotional force may come from something already familiar in Mediterranean consciousness, the knowledge that flourishing places can be humbled suddenly and permanently. This is also why Atlantis has remained so adaptable across later centuries. People continue to project onto it because the core fear never ages. Civilizations still believe themselves secure until nature war or internal failure proves otherwise. Coastal cities still trust seawalls more than they should. Wealth still creates illusions of exemption. The island lost beneath the sea is not merely an ancient curiosity. It is a recurring human pattern, condensed into a single unforgettable form. That does not make every modern use of Atlantis wise, but it helps explain why the image never quite loses its grip. So what disaster does to memory is both destructive and creative. It destroys detail, it breaks chronology, it exaggerates, it moralizes, but it also preserves. It keeps hold of the fact that something overwhelming happened, that a boundary failed, that confidence was punished by reality, and that landscapes which seem stable are not owed their stability forever. Atlantis, viewed this way, is less a historical puzzle box than an archive of compression. Inside it may lie volcanic fear, drowned coast's island decline, and the long human effort to make unbearable events speak in forms that can survive. The exact facts may blur. The warning remains. The strange endurance of Atlantis says as much about those who remember it as it does about whatever may have first inspired it. Some ancient stories remain confined to their original setting. They matter deeply to one people, one region, one ritual tradition, then fade as the world changes around them. Atlantis does something else. It escapes its first literary container and keeps resurfacing whenever civilizations begin to feel uneasy about themselves. That is one reason it survives so powerfully. It is not only a tale about a lost island. It is a tale about the possibility that wealth, brilliance, and confidence may be far less durable than they appear. Every age that suspects this, and every age eventually does find itself able to use Atlantis again. Part of that power lies in timing. Plato writes the story in a world already conscious of political instability, decline, imperial ambition, and the moral fragility of states. The Greek world of his day is sophisticated, competitive, and often violent, filled with cities proud of their achievements, yet constantly confronted by the fact that human arrangements break. A story about a magnificent power undone by its own corruption and by forces larger than itself fits naturally into such a climate. But the fit does not end there. Later, Romans' medieval readers, early modern empire builders, 19th century romantics, 20th century ideologues, and modern audiences, raised on ecological anxiety and civilizational dread, have all found something usable in Atlantis. The details shift. The emotional utility remains. That utility depends on contradiction. Atlantis represents splendor and ruin at once. It is not merely poor and tragic, which would make it easier to pity and then forget. It is grand, technically capable, organized, radiant with abundance, and therefore much more vulnerable to symbolic fall. People are fascinated less by weakness collapsing than by strength collapsing. A humble village lost to flood evokes sorrow. A powerful island world swallowed by sea evokes awe mixed with warning. Scholars still debate the historical origins of Atlantis, but there is little doubt about why the fully formed legend has proved so attractive. It condenses one of civilization's deepest private fears, not that hardship exists, but that success itself may contain the seeds of sudden loss. This is especially true for maritime societies and coastal empires. The sea creates wealth quickly and threatens it constantly. Ports grow rich because they sit in motion in exchange and exposure. They become cosmopolitan, confident, and visually impressive. They also live beside an element that does not care how advanced their bookkeeping is. It is not hard to see why a civilization oriented toward harbours and trade would find Atlantis haunting. The legend suggests that the very thing that makes a society great, its reach, its openness, its command of sea routes, can also make its destruction feel total when nature intervenes. A land empire may retreat inland. An island power has fewer places to run. One lesser-known reason Atlantis persists is that it satisfies two opposite desires at once. It lets people imagine a lost golden age and a deserved punishment in the same story. Some readers are drawn to Atlantis because they want a vanished perfection, a world richer, wiser, more beautiful, or more advanced than the ordinary historical record allows. Others are drawn to it because they want a moral drama, in which pride leads to annihilation. Atlantis conveniently offers both. It can be mourned and condemned at the same time. That dual role gives it unusual flexibility. A legend that can serve nostalgia and judgment equally well is difficult to exhaust. It also helps that Atlantis is associated with incomplete evidence rather than evidence of total absence. The sea leaves room for belief. If Plato had written about a lost city somewhere deep inland, and centuries of travellers found nothing, the story might have hardened into obvious allegory. Water keeps possibilities open. Submerged ruins exist. Coastlines do change. Islands do explode. Harbours do disappear. The evidence remains incomplete not only because ancient memory is fragmentary, but because the environment itself helps preserve uncertainty. That uncertainty is not proof of Atlantis in the literal sense, yet it provides the legend with permanent oxygen. It can never be fully settled, because the kinds of events it gestures toward are demonstrably real, even when the specific narrative is not. There is another reason the story endures, and it may be the most universal of all. Atlantis is a way of thinking about collapse without having to name oneself directly. When a society speaks about a vanished island brought low by excess ambition or bad fortune, it is often also speaking indirectly about its own present fears. The legend acts as a mirror angled just enough to be bearable. It lets people reflect on environmental danger, imperial overreach, moral softness, technological arrogance, or ecological fragility, without having to confess immediately that the target is themselves. Plato may already be doing this with his own political concerns. Later readers certainly do. Atlantis is rarely just about the past. Modern audiences in particular encounter the story under conditions that make its emotional charge unusually strong. Vast coastal populations live close to rising seas. Cities depend on fragile global networks, not unlike in structural principle, the maritime interdependence of the Bronze Age, though on a far larger scale. Climate anxiety has made inundation newly imaginable. Technological confidence coexists with the uneasy knowledge that highly complex systems can fail in cascading ways. In such a world, Atlantis no longer feels like quaint classical speculation. It feels like a myth with current weather in it. What survives in the record suggests the ancient Mediterranean knew the terror of flourishing worlds made fragile by geology and sea. Modern civilization knows a version of that terror too, even if the mechanisms differ. That is why the legend survives more successfully than many better documented historical episodes. Documentation is not the same as symbolic usefulness. A story lasts when it carries a pattern people continue to recognize. Atlantis carries several. Wealth can make societies overconfident. Disaster can expose hidden fragility. Environmental violence can erase what seemed secure. Memory can outlive fact. Ruins and gaps invite moral interpretation. These patterns are broad enough to remain relevant and specific enough to remain vivid. No single explanation fully accounts for the legend's long life, but its adaptability is itself a clue. Atlantis keeps answering needs. History never stops producing. And perhaps that is the deepest reason it endures. The story does not merely describe loss. It stages the moment before loss becomes comprehensible. A great island power looks stable until it is not. A civilization appears exceptional until the sea intervenes. People continue building, trading, ruling, storing wealth, and trusting continuity almost to the very edge of annihilation. This is the most unsettling part because it is the most recognizable. Collapse is often invisible from within until it ceases to be avoidable. Atlantis gives that realization a shape dramatic enough to remember forever. So the legend persists not because the world cannot let go of fantasy, but because the world keeps generating the conditions under which Atlantis feels psychologically true. It lives wherever humans build magnificently near danger and begin to confuse success with permanence. It lives wherever older ruins hint that former powers also believe themselves secure. It lives in every culture that wants to believe it has moved beyond catastrophe and secretly suspects it has not. The lost island remains compelling because it is never only lost. It is always about the next civilization looking at the sea and wondering, however quietly, whether it has understood its own vulnerability any better than the last one did. In the end, Atlantis may matter most when it is released from the burden of being a place someone can finally circle on a map. The obsession with coordinates has always promised more than it can deliver. It offers the fantasy that one perfect excavation, one lucky dive, one newly scanned shelf of seabed will convert legend into certainty. But certainty was probably never what this story was built to preserve. Atlantis survives because it sits in the space between event and interpretation, between disaster and memory, between a real ancient world of unstable islands and the later human need to turn destruction into a shape the mind can keep. It is not a myth in the sense of being detached from reality. It is not history in the sense of being a clean report. It is something more layered and perhaps more revealing than either category on its own. By now the outlines of that layering have become clearer. Beneath the story lies a prehistoric world in which seas rise and coasts disappear, teaching human communities that land itself can be temporary. Upon that lies the Bronze Age Mediterranean, crowded with island societies, palace economies, shipping routes, and delicate networks of wealth, stretched across a geologically restless sea. Within that world comes the eruption of Thera, a disaster immense enough to bury a flourishing town, damage surrounding coasts, disturb the wider Aegean, and alter the balance of maritime power. After the eruption comes the slower, messier history that legend dislikes, but memory eventually consumes, weakening political change, cultural transformation, and the partial loss of once dominant worlds whose names and meanings blur over generations. Then much later comes Plato, drawing these old sediments of fear and recollection into a philosophical narrative about power, order, and destruction. No single explanation fully accounts for Atlantis, but taken together, these layers make the legend far more comprehensible without making it simple. What this means is that Atlantis may be least persuasive when treated literally, and most persuasive when treated seriously. Literalism asks too little of the evidence and too much of coincidence. It wants a single island, a single empire, a single event, and a single act of submergence that matches the text as though the past were waiting politely for modern confirmation. Serious attention asks a harder question. How do real catastrophes survive in cultural memory? How do island civilizations damaged by geology continue as rumour, prestige, and warning after their exact histories have become inaccessible? How does a philosopher use inherited patterns of loss to build a story that is morally charged and still emotionally convincing because it is drawing on truths older than his own composition? These questions do not produce a treasure hunt ending. They produce something better, a historically grounded explanation for why Atlantis has always felt half-remembered. One lesser known but important lesson here is that the ancient world did not separate categories as neatly as modern debate often tries to do. For us, a story is either historical data, literary invention, or mythic symbolism. For ancient cultures, these could coexist much more comfortably. A narrative could be useful, politically meaningful, morally rooted in inherited tradition, and still connected to actual places or events in distorted form. That is why arguments about Atlantis can become sterile when they insist on choosing only between total fact and total fabrication. The story's real durability comes from being neither. It is a vessel into which several kinds of truth have been poured: geological truth, cultural truth, political truth, and the truth of remembered vulnerability. This also explains why Atlantis continues to resist final burial, even among careful scholars who reject sensational claims. The responsible position is not that Atlantis has been proven, because it has not. Nor is it that the story must be empty simply because Plato shaped it artfully. The more balanced conclusion is that Atlantis very likely preserves, in transformed and enlarged form, the memory climate of a real world repeatedly touched by marine catastrophe, coastal loss, and the fall of powerful island-centered societies. Whether the strongest historical echo is Thera-Minoan decline, older drowned landscapes, some mixture of all three, or another layer not yet fully recognized, remains open to debate. The evidence remains incomplete. But incomplete evidence is not the same as absence. Sometimes it's exactly what one should expect when real events have survived only after centuries of retelling, and this may be the most important shift in perspective. Atlantis does not need to be a hidden empire to be true to the ancient world. It needs only to be what many legends are at their strongest, a memory compressed until it becomes larger than any one source. A real island can become the image of all threatened islands. A real eruption can become the symbol of civilizational fragility itself. A real decline can become a moral fall in later hands. A real drowned coast can become the intuition that the sea remembers older maps than the ones humans trust. In that sense, Atlantis is not best understood as a lost place waiting to be recovered intact. It is a record of what happens when history sinks and memory keeps speaking. So perhaps the final answer is this: Atlantis might not be a myth if by myth one means mere fantasy detached from lived experience. But neither is it a literal blueprint. It is more like an afterimage left by real disaster on the long retina of culture. The sea rises, the volcano breaks, harbours fail, powers weaken, generations pass, names stretch, distances grow, a philosopher writes. And what was once many events, many fears, many coastlines, and many losses becomes one unforgettable story about an island world destroyed, because human beings have always needed one clear image for the moment. They discover that even greatness can be temporary. Word count 1109. The sea is quiet again now, as it always becomes quiet again. That may be the oldest deception in this story. Water settles faster than memory does. Cliffs cool. Ash becomes soil. Broken harbours fill with silt. Children are born into landscapes already changed and call them normal, because they have never seen the earlier shape. The world heals just enough to hide the violence that made it. Then only fragments remain: a buried town, a collapsed island, a story told by someone who was told by someone else, an old fear attached to the horizon. Perhaps that is why Atlantis still lingers so stubbornly. Not because it promises a secret kingdom beneath the waves, but because it gives a name to something human beings have always known and never fully accepted. Civilizations are more fragile than they look. Their walls are real, their ships are real, their wealth is real, but so are earthquakes, sea surges, ash clouds, droughts, and the long invisible pressures that gather beneath confidence. A rich world can feel permanent right up until the day it does not. And when it ends, what survives is rarely the full account. More often it is a compressed memory, softened at the edges, sharpened at the centre, carrying forward the emotional truth of a loss too large to preserve in exact detail. Somewhere in the ancient Mediterranean, people really did watch prosperous shores fail. They really did see islands, broken coastlines altered, and sea routes turned suddenly hostile. They really did inherit stories about places that had once stood where water now moved. Whether Atlantis belongs most to Thera, to the Minoan world, to older drowned landscapes, or to several of these at once, the deeper pattern remains the same. The legend endures because the disaster behind it, whatever its precise shape, belongs to a category of experience that never fully leaves the human mind. And so the image stays with us, an island rich with life, then silence. A horizon darkening at noon, the sea crossing its boundary, the map becoming unreliable, the memory outliving the stones. In that final image there is no treasure to recover, no perfect certainty waiting on the seabed. There is only the older lesson the ancient world knew well, and the modern world still struggles to hear. Land shifts, water remembers, and every civilization, no matter how accomplished, lives for a while beside forces that do not care how permanent it believes itself to be.